Hello and welcome back to the Haunted Slumber. Before we begin tonight's story, take a moment to get comfortable, close your eyes, and let your mind drift. If you're enjoying these tales, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're listening from around the world. Now let the lights dim, the curtain rise, and may this story guide you into a deep, haunted sleep. The Abyss Within. The wind howled through the trees, a mournful, desolate sound that seemed to echo from the very depths of the forest. The old house stood at the edge of the woods, its windows dark and hollow like empty eyes staring out into the night. Aiden stood in front of the house, his breath fogging in the cold air. The letter he'd received lay crumpled in his hand, its ink smudged and fading. It was from his sister, Lila. The words were desperate, scrawled in a frantic, uneven hand. "Aiden, please, come back. There's something in the house. Something in the walls. It won't let me sleep." Lila hadn't been seen or heard from in weeks. The police had searched the house and found no trace of her. They said she'd likely run away, just another missing person swallowed up by the night. But Aiden knew his sister. She wouldn't just leave without telling him. And the letter, it was dated 3 days ago. Now, as he stood before the house they'd grown up in, Aiden felt the weight of the past pressing down on him. Memories flickered through his mind, the laughter they'd shared, the fights, the way Lila used to stare at the walls, her eyes wide and haunted. "They're whispering to me," she'd said once, her voice trembling. "The people in the walls." Aiden shook off the memory and stepped forward, the wooden steps groaning beneath his weight. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking open with a slow, ominous wail. Inside, the house was dark and cold. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and rotting wood. Shadows stretched long and deep across the floor, twisting and writhing like dark, spectral hands. "Lila?" Aiden called out, his voice echoing through the empty halls. Silence. He moved deeper into the house, the floorboards creaking beneath him. The walls loomed high and oppressive, their peeling wallpaper sagging like rotting flesh. Somewhere in the distance, a faint, rhythmic tapping echoed through the silence. Aiden followed the sound, his heart pounding. The tapping grew louder, more insistent as he approached the door to the basement. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Memories of childhood fears rose up within him, the stories Lila used to tell about the basement, about the voices she heard coming from the darkness below. "They're watching me," she'd whispered once, her eyes wide and terrified. "They want me to come down there." Aiden took a deep breath and opened the door. The air that rushed out was cold and damp, carrying with it a faint, foul odor like something old and decayed. He flicked on the basement light. The bulb sputtered to life, casting a sickly, yellow glow over the stairs. Aiden descended, each step echoing through the silence. The walls seemed to close in around him, the air growing colder and heavier with each passing second. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement stretched out before him, a vast, dark space filled with old furniture covered in dust-streaked sheets. The tapping was louder now, coming from the far corner of the room. Aiden moved toward the sound, his heart hammering in his chest. The tapping stopped. Silence fell, heavy and oppressive. "Lila," he whispered, his voice trembling. The room was empty. The only sound was the creak of the house settling around him. Then, from behind him, a whisper, "Aiden." He spun around, his flashlight beam sweeping through the darkness. There was no one there. Just shadows, shifting and writhing against the walls. But then he saw it, the outline of a door, half hidden behind a stack of old boxes. A door that hadn't been there before. Aiden swallowed, his mouth dry. The door was old and wooden, its surface scarred and splintered. Faint whispers seemed to seep from beneath it, like voices trapped on the other side. With a trembling hand, Aiden reached for the doorknob. The metal was icy cold beneath his fingers. He twisted it slowly, the door creaking open with a low, mournful wail. Beyond the door was darkness, a void that seemed to stretch on forever. And from the depths of that darkness came a sound that made Aiden's blood run cold. It was Lila's voice. "Aiden, help me." Aiden's breath caught in his throat. The darkness beyond the door seemed to pulse as if it were a living, breathing entity. Lila's voice echoed through the void, faint and distant, yet unmistakable. "Aiden, help me." He stepped forward, his foot hovering over the threshold. The air was colder here, as if the darkness itself was sucking the warmth from the room. Aiden gripped the flashlight tighter, its beam flickering and weak. "Lila," he called out, his voice trembling. No response. Only the oppressive silence pressing down on him like a suffocating weight. Aiden swallowed, forcing himself to move forward. The darkness swallowed him, thick and impenetrable like black fog. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the scent of wet earth and decay. The ground beneath his feet was soft, almost spongy, as though he were walking on rotting wood or soil. The walls closed in around him, narrowing with each step, the rough stone scraping against his shoulders. Aiden's pulse pounded in his ears. The corridor stretched on endlessly, winding and twisting, as if the house had grown labyrinthine beneath the surface. "Lila," he called again, his voice barely a whisper. From somewhere up ahead came a sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It echoed through the darkness, growing louder, more insistent. Aiden quickened his pace, his heart hammering. The tapping grew louder, transforming into a frantic, urgent pounding. He rounded a corner and found himself standing in a small, circular chamber. The walls were covered in dark, pulsing roots that seemed to writhe and twitch like living veins. In the center of the room stood a single wooden chair, and in that chair sat Lila. Her head hung low, her hair matted and filthy. Her wrists were bound to the arms of the chair with thick, rotting vines. Her eyes were closed, her lips moving silently as though whispering to herself. "Lila!" Aiden rushed forward, dropping to his knees before her. "Lila, wake up!" Lila's eyes snapped open. They were empty, blank, as though she were staring through him. "Aiden," she whispered, her voice cracked and dry. "I'm here. I'm going to get you out of here." Aiden reached for the vines, trying to untangle them, but they were wrapped tight, digging into her skin like living shackles. Lila's gaze darted around the room, her eyes wide and panicked. "They're watching us." Aiden paused, his hands trembling. "Who? Who's watching us?" Lila's eyes filled with tears. "The ones in the walls. They're always watching, always whispering." Aiden's skin prickled. He turned, shining the flashlight around the room. The roots on the walls seemed to twitch and shiver as though something were moving behind them. "They said you'd come," Lila whispered, her voice dropping to a terrified murmur. "They said you'd come back, and now they won't let you leave." Aiden gritted his teeth, yanking at the vines. They refused to budge, tightening around Lila's wrists like hungry snakes. "Hold on," he said, reaching into his pocket for the pocket knife he always carried. But before he could open it, the roots on the walls began to move. They writhed and twisted, stretching out toward him like grasping hands. Aiden leapt back, his flashlight beam dancing across the walls. The roots were pulsing, throbbing, as though something inside them was trying to break free. Lila's screams echoed through the chamber, rising in pitch until they became a single, high-pitched wail. Aiden covered his ears, the sound reverberating through his skull like nails on glass. The roots swelled and split open, and from within them emerged dozens of eyes, dark, hollow eyes that stared at him with a malevolent, unblinking gaze. "They're hungry," Lila sobbed, her head lolling back. "They're so hungry." The eyes blinked in unison, and the walls began to close in, the roots twisting and writhing like a nest of serpents. Aiden grabbed Lila by the shoulders, shaking her. "Lila, we have to go. We have to." But before he could finish, the roots lashed out, coiling around his wrists and ankles, pulling him down to the ground. The eyes loomed closer, filling his vision until there was nothing but darkness. And then the whispers began. The whispers crept into Aiden's mind like icy fingers sliding through the cracks of his sanity. They were soft, insidious, murmuring words he couldn't quite understand, but their intent was unmistakable. They wanted him to stay. Aiden struggled against the roots that coiled around his wrists and ankles, their grip tightening like a vice. The eyes on the walls blinked in unison, watching, waiting. "Lila!" Aiden shouted, twisting against the roots. "Lila, wake up!" Lila's head lolled to one side, her eyes half open, her lips moving silently. The whispers grew louder, swelling to a deafening chorus. It was as if the house itself was speaking, the walls, the floor, the ceiling, all of it alive and breathing. "They're watching. They're waiting. They're hungry." Aiden grit his teeth, focusing his mind. He couldn't afford to lose it now. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, he yanked his arm free, the roots snapping with a sickening wet sound. He reached for his pocket knife, flicking it open with shaking hands. The blade gleamed faintly in the dim light, and without hesitation, he hacked at the roots binding his legs. The roots twitched and writhed, bleeding a thick, black ichor that smelled of rot and earth. "Lila!" Aiden scrambled to his feet, stumbling toward his sister. Lila's eyes rolled back in her head, her mouth opening and closing as though she were trying to speak. Aiden grabbed her shoulders, shaking her. "Lila, look at me. We have to go." Her eyes flicked toward him, and for a brief moment they were her eyes, the eyes of the sister he remembered. But then they clouded over, darkening to the color of ash. "They're inside me," she whispered, her voice hollow and distant. "They're inside all of us." Aiden felt a chill run down his spine. Before he could respond, the walls began to tremble. The eyes blinked in unison, and the whispers grew louder, merging into a single, guttural chant. "Stay with us. Stay with us. Stay with us." The floor quaked beneath Aiden's feet, and the roots burst forth from the ground, reaching for him. Aiden slashed at them with the knife, the blade slicing through the writhing tendrils. But for every root he cut, two more emerged, lashing out like angry serpents. Lila screamed, her body convulsing against the chair. The roots were tightening around her wrists and ankles, pulling her deeper into the floorboards. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and beneath it something moved, dark, wriggling shapes that crawled beneath her flesh. "No!" Aiden lunged forward, grabbing her arm. "Lila, hold on." But as he touched her skin, a jolt of icy cold shot through his body. The whispers intensified, pouring into his mind like a swarm of insects. "Aiden, come to us, come home." He staggered back, clutching his head. The room was spinning, the walls undulating as if the house were breathing. The roots were everywhere now, covering the walls, the ceiling, the floor, their dark, gnarled surfaces pulsing with a sickly, rhythmic beat. And then he heard it, a voice that cut through the whispers, deep and resonant, echoing through the room. "You shouldn't have come back, Aiden." Aiden's heart dropped. He knew that voice. It was his father's. Aiden turned, his flashlight beam sweeping across the room. And there, standing in the doorway, was the figure of a man. Tall, gaunt, and shrouded in shadow, his eyes dark and empty, his mouth stretched into a twisted grin. "Dad?" Aiden's voice trembled. The figure stepped forward, the roots parting to make way for him. The air grew colder, the stench of decay overwhelming. "You left us here," the figure said, its voice a hollow, echoing rasp. "You left us to rot." Aiden shook his head, backing away. "You're not real. You can't be real." The figure stepped closer, the darkness swirling around it like a shroud. Its eyes locked onto Aiden's, and Aiden felt himself sinking, falling into the abyss of those dark, empty sockets. "You left us," the figure repeated, its voice rising to a deafening roar. "Now it's your turn to stay." The roots surged forward, wrapping around Aiden's legs and arms, dragging him down to the floor. The air was thick, suffocating, the whispers growing louder and louder until they were all he could hear. "No!" Aiden screamed, thrashing against the roots. "Lila! Lila, Wake up. But Lila was gone. The chair was empty, the rope severed, and the room was collapsing in on itself, the walls closing in like a living tomb. And then, in the darkness, Aiden heard his sister's voice, faint and distant as though from the other side of a great, yawning chasm. Aiden, they're taking me into the walls. And then the darkness swallowed him whole. Aiden's consciousness drifted in a void of suffocating blackness. There was no floor, no ceiling, no walls, just an endless expanse of darkness, pressing against him like a wet, heavy shroud. His limbs felt weighted, as though the air itself was thick as tar. His mind was a muddle of whispers, overlapping and interweaving like a tangled web. They're inside me. They're inside all of us. Lila's voice echoed, her words dissolving into the dissonant chorus. Aiden tried to speak, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. It was as if he no longer had a mouth or lungs or even a body. He was simply a disembodied mind, floating through an ocean of black. And then, a pinprick of light appeared in the distance, a faint, flickering glow. It grew brighter, expanding until it formed a doorway. Beyond it, Aiden could see a room. It was the living room of the old house, but the walls were covered in a thick, pulsating layer of roots. Aiden stumbled forward, his legs heavy and unsteady, as though he hadn't walked in years. As he passed through the doorway, the air grew colder. The walls shuddered, and the roots quivered, as if alive. "Lila!" he shouted, his voice echoing unnaturally. A soft, eerie humming floated through the air. It was a lullaby, the same lullaby their mother used to sing. The melody was slow and haunting, each note dripping with sorrow. Aiden followed the sound, his bare feet sticking to the cold, damp floor. The roots squirmed beneath him, writhing like a nest of snakes. "Lila!" he called again, but the lullaby continued, growing louder. A doorway loomed ahead, framed by thick, rotting roots that bled a dark, viscous sap. Aiden reached for the doorknob, his hand trembling. It was ice cold, and as he turned it, a shiver ran down his spine. The door swung open with a groan, revealing a small, dimly lit room. At the center of the room was a chair, and in the chair sat Lila. Her head was bowed, her hair hanging limply over her face. "Lila!" Aiden stepped forward, his heart hammering in his chest. The lullaby continued, its melody now a low, keening wail. Lila's shoulders shook, and Aiden realized she was sobbing. Dark stains spread across the front of her dress, and her hands were bound with thick, oozing roots. Aiden rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside her. "Lila, it's me. It's Aiden. I'm here to get you out." Lila's head snapped up, and Aiden recoiled. Her eyes were hollow and black, voids of infinite darkness. Her mouth opened, but instead of a scream, a torrent of black ichor poured forth, dribbling down her chin. "They're inside me," she rasped, her voice an echo of 1,000 other voices. "They're inside all of us." Aiden scrambled backward, his hands slipping in the black ichor. The room began to shift and contort, the walls closing in, the roots reaching out like grasping fingers. "Stay with us," the voices chanted. "Stay forever." Lila stood, the roots unraveling from her wrists and ankles. Her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her eyes fixed on Aiden. "You can't leave, Aiden," she said, her voice layered with the voices of their parents, their friends, the children who had vanished in the woods. "You brought us back. You brought them back." Aiden stumbled to his feet, his heart pounding. The air was thick with the scent of rot, and the roots slithered across the floor, coiling around his ankles. "This isn't real," he muttered, clutching his head. "None of this is real." "But it is," Lila said, stepping closer. Her skin was translucent, and beneath it, dark shapes twisted and writhed. "You were always meant to stay, Aiden. We were all meant to stay." The walls shuddered, and the whispers grew louder, swelling to a deafening roar. The room began to disintegrate, the floorboards splitting open to reveal a gaping abyss beneath. Aiden staggered backward, his arms windmilling as the ground beneath him gave way. He fell, plunging into the black abyss, the whispers trailing after him like a swarm of insects. As he fell, he saw faces in the darkness. Familiar faces, twisted and contorted in agony. His father, his mother, the children who had gone missing. They reached for him with skeletal hands, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams. Aiden's back hit the ground with a bone-jarring thud. The air was knocked from his lungs, and he lay there, staring up at the endless void above him. And then a face loomed over him. It was Lila, but not Lila. Her eyes were black voids, her mouth a gaping maw that stretched far wider than humanly possible. "You can't leave," she said, her voice echoing in the dark. "You belong to the house now." Aiden tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. The roots surged forward, wrapping around his limbs, his chest, his throat. They pulled him deeper, dragging him into the cold, wet earth. And as the darkness closed in around him, the lullaby played on, a haunting, endless melody that echoed through the abyss. Aiden's eyes snapped open. Cold sweat drenched his skin, and his heart raced against his ribcage like a trapped bird. The ceiling above him was cracked and stained, and the air was thick with the scent of mold and decay. He was back in the living room of the old house. He sat up, his head pounding. The last thing he remembered was falling into the abyss, the void consuming him, and Lila's eyes, hollow, black, and full of something ancient and malevolent. But now he was here, back in the room where it all began. The furniture was covered in white sheets, stained with patches of dampness that spread like ink blots. The walls were crawling with veins of black mold, and the floorboards creaked beneath him as he stood. Aiden's legs trembled as he took a step forward. The house was unervingly silent. No whispers, no lullaby, just an oppressive stillness that pressed down on him like a suffocating fog. "Lila?" he called, his voice barely above a whisper. No response. Aiden moved toward the staircase, his gaze fixed on the second floor. The banister was slick with something dark and sticky, and the steps groaned beneath his weight. Shadows loomed in the corners of the hallway, shifting and pulsating as if alive. He made his way to Lila's room, the door slightly ajar. The air inside was colder, and the walls were lined with childhood drawings. But they weren't the innocent crayon scrawls he remembered. The drawings depicted dark, twisted trees with screaming faces in the bark. Shadowy figures loomed beneath the branches, their eyes black and empty. In each picture, a girl with long dark hair stood at the center, her face obscured by darkness. Aiden's stomach churned. He recognized the girl, It was Lila. Lila, he said again, his voice shaking. A creaking sound echoed through the room. Aiden spun around. The closet door swung open, revealing nothing but darkness. Cold air spilled out, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and rot. Aiden stepped closer, his hands trembling. He peered inside, squinting to make out any shape or form. But it was just darkness. And then, a pair of eyes blinked open, staring back at him. Aiden stumbled backward, his breath hitching. The eyes were black and hollow, and they seemed to stretch, growing larger and larger until they filled the entire closet. "You brought them here," a voice echoed from within the darkness. "You brought us back." Aiden's back hit the wall, and his pulse thundered in his ears. The closet door swung shut with a deafening slam, and the house shuddered as if in response. "Lila!" he shouted, his voice cracking. A distant sound echoed from downstairs, the front door creaking open. Aiden sprinted down the hallway, nearly tripping over the loose floorboards. The house seemed to shift around him, the walls warping and bending as he ran. When he reached the first floor, he saw her. Lila stood in the center of the living room, her back to him. Her long, dark hair hung limp and wet, and her shoulders trembled. "Lila?" She didn't respond. Aiden approached slowly, his hands shaking. "Lila, it's me. It's Aiden. We need to get out of here." Lila's head tilted to the side, her neck bending at an unnatural angle. Aiden swallowed, a cold chill racing down his spine. "Lila?" She turned to face him, and Aiden's heart plummeted. Her eyes were black voids, swirling with darkness. Her mouth hung open, and thick, dark liquid oozed from her lips. Her skin was ashen, her veins dark and pulsing beneath the surface. "You let them in," she said, her voice a hollow, echoing rasp. Aiden took a step back. "Lila, The floorboards beneath Lila's feet creaked, and roots burst forth from the wood, wrapping around her ankles and wrists. She let out a choked scream as the roots pulled her down, dragging her toward the floor. "Aiden!" she shrieked, her voice laced with terror. "Help me!" Aiden lunged forward, grabbing her arms. The roots writhed around her, tightening and pulling. The floorboards split open, revealing a yawning chasm of darkness beneath them. "Hold on!" Aiden shouted, his muscles straining. But the roots were too strong. They slithered up Lila's legs, winding around her torso, her neck, her face. Her eyes widened, and for a brief moment, they returned to normal, soft, brown, filled with fear. "Aiden," she whispered, her voice small and fragile. And then she was gone. The roots yanked her down, and the floorboards snapped shut with a bone-rattling crash. Aiden fell to the ground, his chest heaving. The house was silent again. No whispers, no cries, no lullaby. Just the cold, empty stillness. Aiden pushed himself up, his hands shaking. "Lila!" he screamed, his voice echoing through the house. But there was no answer. Only the sound of the wind howling through the cracks in the walls, and the distant, haunting melody of the lullaby. A soft, mournful tune that carried through the empty halls, as if the house itself was singing a lullaby to its lost children. Aiden sat slumped against the wall, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The room was silent now, and the house loomed around him like a cavernous, breathing entity. His mind spun, replaying the moment Lila was torn away from him, swallowed by the roots, dragged into the abyss beneath the floorboards. His fingers trembled as he touched the wood where she had vanished. The floor was solid and cold, as if nothing had happened, as if Lila had never existed. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. "No." A soft, rhythmic thudding echoed through the room. Aiden's head snapped up. The sound was coming from upstairs, a slow, deliberate pounding that reverberated through the walls. Thud, thud, thud. Aiden pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaky and unsteady. The hallway loomed before him, stretching longer than it should, the shadows gathering at the far end like a waiting crowd. The thudding grew louder. It was coming from the attic. Aiden swallowed hard, his throat dry. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, to run and never look back. But he couldn't, not without Lila. He forced himself to move forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. The walls seemed to bend and twist as he passed, the plaster bubbling as if something were trying to push through from the other side. When he reached the door to the attic, the thudding stopped. Silence, heavy and oppressive. Aiden hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. The air was cold, and the door itself was damp, as though moisture had seeped through it from the other side. He took a deep breath and turned the knob. The door swung open with a low, groaning creak. The attic was bathed in shadow, the only light coming from a single, flickering candle at the far end of the room. Its weak flame cast distorted shadows across the walls, and the air was thick with the scent of rotting wood and damp earth. Aiden stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath him. The walls were lined with old photographs, sepia-toned images of people he didn't recognize, their faces obscured by dark smudges, their eyes black voids. At the center of the room, beneath the flickering candle, was a chair, and in the chair sat a figure. Aiden's breath hitched. It was Lila. She sat motionless, her hair hanging over her face, her hands resting limply in her lap. The candlelight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across her pale skin. "Lila," Aiden whispered, his voice shaking. She didn't respond. Aiden stepped closer, the floorboards groaning beneath him. The air grew colder, and the shadows thickened, swirling around them like mist. "Lila, it's me," he said, reaching out a trembling hand. Lila's head jerked up, and Aiden recoiled. Her eyes were black, empty voids, and her mouth hung open. Her jaw stretched far too wide. Dark liquid dripped from her lips, staining her dress. "You brought them back," she rasped, her voice layered with a chorus of other voices. Male and female, young and old, all speaking in unison. "You opened the door." Aiden stumbled backward, his chest tightening. The walls trembled, and the photographs on the walls began to pulse, the faces in them writhing and twisting as though they were alive. "Lila, please," Aiden said, his back hitting the wall. "This isn't you." Lila stood up, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. The candle flickered violently, and the shadows coalesced around her, wrapping around her limbs like dark tendrils. "They're inside you now," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "They're inside all of us." The walls began to bleed, dark rivulets of black liquid seeping down the plaster. The photographs pulsed and shuddered, the faces within them opening their mouths in silent screams. Aiden's vision blurred, his head pounding. He clutched his temples, the whispers flooding his mind. A cacophony of voices, all chanting the same haunting lullaby. "Stay with us," they whispered. "Stay forever." Aiden dropped to his knees, the room spinning around him. The shadows swirled and surged, closing in like a living, breathing mass. And then, a cold hand touched his shoulder. Aiden gasped, jerking away. Lila stood over him, her black eyes boring into his. Her mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. "You can't leave," she said, her voice a guttural rasp. "You belong to the house now." The floorboards beneath Aiden cracked and split open, revealing a gaping chasm of darkness. The roots burst forth, snaking around his wrists and ankles, dragging him down. Aiden screamed, struggling against them, but the roots were too strong. They tightened around his limbs, pulling him deeper into the abyss. Lila loomed over him, her face inches from his, her black eyes swirling with darkness. "Stay with me, Aiden," she whispered, her lips brushing against his ear. "Stay forever." The floorboards snapped shut, and the room went silent. The candle flickered once, twice, and then was snuffed out, plunging the attic into complete darkness. Aiden's world was darkness. He was suspended in an endless void, his limbs weightless and unresponsive. The whispers echoed around him, 1,000 voices layered atop one another, their words indistinct and haunting. "Stay, stay, stay." The chant grew louder, reverberating through his skull. Aiden squeezed his eyes shut, his head throbbing. Suddenly, the darkness fractured. Light pierced through the void, and Aiden's body dropped, slamming against a cold, hard surface. The impact forced the air from his lungs, and he lay gasping, blinking against the blinding light. When his vision cleared, he realized he was lying on the wooden floorboards of the living room. The house loomed around him, its walls pulsating like a living thing. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and dark stains spread across the fabric like ink blots. Aiden pushed himself to his feet, his body aching. The whispers had faded, replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rot. "Lila," Aiden called, his voice echoing through the empty house. No response. He moved through the room, his footsteps creaking against the floorboards. Shadows flickered in the corners of his vision, and the walls seemed to bend and sway as he passed. Aiden reached the staircase, glancing up. The second floor loomed above, the banister shrouded in darkness. He swallowed, dread pooling in his gut. He knew he had to go up there, but every instinct screamed against it. Before he could take a step, a sound echoed through the house, a low, mournful wail. It was coming from the basement. Aiden turned, his heart hammering. The basement door was slightly ajar, and a cold wind seeped through the gap, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and something else, something metallic. Aiden swallowed, his throat dry. He stepped forward, each movement heavy and sluggish, as if the air itself was resisting him. The basement door groaned open, revealing a staircase that descended into darkness. The wailing grew louder, a haunting, mournful cry that sent chills skittering down Aiden's spine. He gripped the banister and took a step down, then another, and another. The steps creaked beneath his weight, and the air grew colder with each descent. The walls were damp and glistening, and dark roots twisted through the cracks, pulsing as if alive. Aiden reached the bottom, his breath fogging in the frigid air. The basement stretched out before him, a cavernous expanse filled with shadow and the distant sound of dripping water. At the far end of the room stood a figure. Aiden's breath caught in his throat. It was Lila. She stood with her back to him, her long, dark hair hanging limp and wet. The wailing had stopped, and the silence pressed down like a suffocating shroud. "Lila," Aiden said, his voice shaking. She didn't respond. Aiden took a step forward, the floor slick beneath his feet. The ground was covered in a thin layer of water, and dark, slimy roots twisted through the puddles, writhing like snakes. "Lila, it's me," he said, reaching out a trembling hand. Lila's head jerked to the side, her neck bending at an unnatural angle. Aiden stopped, his heart thundering. She turned around, and Aiden's blood ran cold. Her eyes were gone, replaced by dark, empty sockets that wept black sludge. Her mouth hung open, a gaping void, and dark liquid dripped from her lips, staining her dress. "You let them in," she rasped, her voice hollow and layered with a chorus of other voices. Aiden stumbled back, his hands shaking. "Lila, I was trying to save you." Lila took a step forward, her movements jerky and disjointed. The roots on the ground surged toward Aiden, winding around his ankles and tightening. "You brought them back," Lila said, her blackened mouth stretching into a wide, unnatural grin. "Now they're here forever." The roots coiled up Aiden's legs, constricting his muscles and dragging him down. He struggled against them, his breath coming in panicked gasps. "Lila!" he screamed, his voice echoing through the basement. Lila's expression twisted, her empty eyes narrowing. "There is no Lila, only them." The roots surged, yanking Aiden to the ground. The water splashed around him, soaking his clothes. The darkness deepened, and the basement walls seemed to close in, pressing tighter and tighter. Aiden clawed at the roots, his fingers slipping against the slimy tendrils. The air grew colder, and the sound of the lullaby echoed through the darkness. A soft, haunting melody that reverberated through Aiden's skull. "Stay with us," the voices whispered. "Stay forever." Aiden's vision blurred, and the room began to spin. The walls seemed to melt, and the floor opened up beneath him, revealing a yawning chasm of darkness. And then, from the depths of the darkness, a pair of eyes blinked open, hollow, black, and filled with endless void. Aiden screamed as the darkness swallowed him whole. Aiden awoke to the sound of dripping water. The air was frigid and heavy, pressing down on him like a wet blanket. He was lying on a damp, uneven surface, and when he tried to sit up, pain lanced through his limbs. "Where am I?" he whispered, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. His surroundings were shrouded in darkness, but as his eyes adjusted, he began to make out vague shapes: stone walls, twisted roots, and what looked like the remnants of broken furniture scattered across the floor. Aiden pushed himself up, his arms shaking. The ground beneath him was covered in a slick, black sludge that smelled of rot and decay. The walls seemed to pulse as though they were breathing, and the air was filled with the distant, haunting echo of that lullaby. "Stay with us, stay forever." The voices drifted from every direction, and Aiden's skin prickled with fear. "Lila," he called out, his voice trembling. There was no answer. Aiden staggered forward, his feet squelching through the thick sludge. The ground seemed to shift beneath him as if it were alive, and shadows flitted across the walls, their forms too vague and indistinct to identify. "Lila," he shouted, louder this time. The lullaby grew louder, the haunting melody weaving through the air like a living thing. It was the same lullaby he had heard before, the one Lila had hummed to calm herself, the one that had haunted his dreams. "Stay with us." Aiden turned sharply, his heart hammering against his ribs. A figure stood in the corner of the room, shrouded in shadow. Its eyes glowed with a dim, eerie light, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. "Who are you?" Aiden demanded, his fists clenched. The figure stepped forward, its bare feet sloshing through the sludge. As it moved, the shadows peeled away, revealing a woman with hollow eyes and blackened lips. Her skin was pale and stretched tight across her bones, and her hair hung in wet, tangled strands. It was Lila. "Lila," Aiden breathed, relief flooding through him. He moved toward her, arms outstretched. "Lila, thank God, Abe." But as he reached for her, she recoiled, her eyes widening with fear. "Stay away," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You let them in." Aiden's hands dropped to his sides. "What are you talking about?" Lila's gaze darted around the room, her pupils dilated and unfocused. "They're inside now. Inside me. Inside everything. Lila, I don't understand it. You opened the door," she screamed, her voice echoing through the room. "You let them in, and now they won't leave." Before Aiden could respond, the walls trembled and the ground beneath them buckled. Dark, slimy roots burst forth from the floor, writhing like snakes. They twisted around Lila's legs, dragging her down as she screamed. "No!" Aiden lunged forward, grabbing her wrists. Lila's eyes locked onto his, her expression a mask of fear and anguish. "Aiden, they're hungry. They need more." "What do you mean?" Aiden shouted, struggling to pull her free. But the roots tightened, coiling around Lila's body and dragging her down into the sludge. "You let them in," she said again, her voice growing weaker. "And now they'll never stop." Her face sank beneath the sludge, her eyes fixed on Aiden until the last moment, when the blackened roots swallowed her whole. Aiden screamed, clawing at the ground, but the roots had already receded, leaving nothing but a pool of dark, churning muck. The lullaby echoed through the air, louder than ever. "Stay with us, stay forever." Aiden collapsed onto the ground, his chest heaving. The room was spinning, the walls closing in around him. The darkness pressed down like a weight, suffocating him. And then, from the depths of the room, he heard a voice. "Aiden." It was Lila's voice. Aiden pushed himself up, his eyes wild. "Lila?" The voice echoed again, closer this time. "Aiden, help me." Aiden's heart hammered against his chest. He staggered to his feet, his knees shaking. The room stretched and twisted around him, the walls warping and undulating like a living organism. "Lila, where are you?" "Here." Aiden turned sharply, his eyes scanning the darkness. Shadows shifted and morphed, forming twisted, nightmarish shapes that loomed over him. Faces appeared in the walls, their eyes hollow and empty, mouths opening and closing in silent screams. "Stay with us." The voices grew louder, overlapping and echoing in Aiden's head. He pressed his hands to his ears, but the sound only intensified. "Stay forever." Aiden's knees buckled and he fell to the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The darkness swarmed around him, pressing closer and closer until it felt as though it was crawling beneath his skin. And then the ground split open and Aiden was falling. Aiden plunged into the darkness, the air rushing past him in a deafening roar. The abyss swallowed him, and for a moment he was weightless, suspended in a void where time and space lost all meaning. Then, without warning, he struck the ground. The impact rattled his bones, forcing the air from his lungs. He lay there for a moment, gasping, his mind spinning. The ground beneath him was cold and damp, a surface slick with a foul, oily residue. Aiden pushed himself up, his arms trembling. Darkness pressed in from all sides, thick and impenetrable. There was no sense of where he was, no walls, no ceiling, just endless, suffocating blackness. "Lila," he called out, his voice a ragged whisper. The darkness swallowed his words, offering only silence in return. Aiden staggered forward, his feet squelching through the muck. The air was heavy with the stench of rot and decay, and every breath tasted of mildew and something far worse, something metallic like blood. "Stay with us." The voices echoed all around him, disembodied and hollow. They overlapped and intertwined, creating a nightmarish cacophony that set Aiden's teeth on edge. "Stay forever." Aiden pressed his hands to his ears, but the voices only grew louder. They were inside his head now, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. Then a light flickered in the distance. Faint and unsteady, it pulsed like a dying star, casting long, undulating shadows across the ground. Aiden's heart leaped. "Lila." He stumbled toward the light, his legs heavy and uncooperative. The ground seemed to shift beneath him as if it were breathing, the muck churning and bubbling underfoot. The light grew brighter, and as Aiden drew closer, he could see that it was coming from a single, flickering lantern. It hung from a twisted tree, its gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Aiden reached out, his hand trembling. The lantern's glass was cracked, and its flame sputtered and hissed, casting eerie, dancing shadows across the ground. "Lila?" A figure stepped into the circle of light. Aiden's breath caught in his throat. It was Lila, but her eyes were vacant, staring straight through him. Her skin was ashen, her lips cracked and dry. Black sludge dripped from the corners of her mouth, trailing down her neck and staining her white dress. "Aiden!" Her voice was flat, empty, a hollow echo of the girl he once knew. Aiden reached for her, his fingers shaking. "Lila, what's happened to you?" Lila's eyes blinked slowly, as if struggling to focus. "You let them in. You let them in." "Let who in?" "Them." Lila's head snapped to the side, her eyes widening. Behind her, the darkness seethed and writhed, and from within it emerged dozens of figures. They moved as one, their bodies contorted and broken, their eyes black pits of nothingness. They surrounded Aiden, their mouths moving in unison, whispering the same words over and over again. "Stay with us, stay forever." Aiden stumbled backward, his back pressing against the tree. The lantern above him flickered wildly, the flame growing weaker with each passing second. "Lila, please," Aiden begged, his voice cracking. "We can get out of here. We can still escape." Lila stepped closer, her blackened eyes locking onto his. "There is no escape," she said, her voice echoing with a chorus of other voices, all speaking in perfect unison. "You opened the door. You let them in. Now they will never leave." The lantern's flame sputtered, then died. Darkness swallowed them whole. Aiden's scream echoed into the abyss, swallowed instantly by the suffocating dark. His fingers groped blindly, desperate to find anything solid to hold onto. But there was nothing, only the cold, slick ground beneath him and the oppressive weight of the blackness pressing down. "Lila," he cried, but his voice was a mere whisper against the vast emptiness. Somewhere in the distance, the soft, wet squelching of footsteps echoed back at him. They grew louder, closer, until they were circling him, closing in. Aiden's breath hitched, his pulse hammering in his ears. "Stay!" The voice was right beside his ear, cold and rasping. Aiden whipped around, but there was no one there. Only the darkness and the sound of his own ragged breathing. "Stay with us, forever." More voices joined in, overlapping, drowning each other out until the air was a sea of whispers. Aiden clamped his hands over his ears, stumbling backward. His foot struck something hard and he tumbled to the ground, landing on his back. Above him, the darkness rippled, and from within it, a face began to form. pale and translucent, its eyes were endless black voids, and its mouth gaped open, stretching wider and wider until it was nothing but a chasm of infinite darkness. Aiden scrambled backward, his hands clawing at the ground. The face followed him, descending closer. "You let us in," it hissed, the words a wet, rotting breath against his skin. "You opened the door, and now we will never leave." Aiden squeezed his eyes shut, his chest heaving. "This isn't real. This isn't real." The darkness erupted with a chorus of laughter, a sound that was both human and not, high-pitched and cruel, like nails scraping against glass. Aiden pressed his hands harder against his ears, his fingers digging into his scalp. "Lila, help me." The laughter ceased abruptly. The air grew deathly still. Then a soft, familiar voice echoed from somewhere far away. "Aiden." Aiden's eyes snapped open. The darkness was still there, but now a faint, silvery light shimmered in the distance, like the reflection of the moon on water. "Lila?" Aiden pushed himself to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. The light pulsed softly, drawing him toward it. The whispers still echoed all around, but now they sounded further away, as if receding back into the void. He stumbled forward, his hands outstretched, reaching for the light. The closer he got, the warmer it became, its soft glow washing over his skin like a comforting embrace. The light intensified, and as Aiden drew nearer, he could see its source. It was a lantern, a large, ornate lantern that hung from a skeletal tree. The tree's branches twisted and coiled like serpents, each one ending in a claw-like hand. The ground around the tree was littered with bones, human bones, their surfaces polished smooth as if they'd been picked clean. Aiden stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the lantern's flame. It flickered and danced, casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. Then he saw her. Lila. She was standing beneath the lantern, her white dress stained with mud and blood, her hair hanging in wet, matted strands around her face. Her eyes were closed, her lips moving as if she were whispering to herself. "Lila," Aiden said, his voice breaking. "It's me. It's Aiden." Lila's eyes snapped open. But they weren't her eyes. They were black, endless, bottomless black. "You let them in," she said, her voice not her own. It was deeper, darker, a chorus of 1,000 voices speaking as one. "Lila, please." Lila stepped forward, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being yanked on strings. Her mouth twisted into a smile that was too wide, her teeth glistening like wet bone. "We're all here now, Aiden," she said, her head tilting to one side. "And we're never leaving." From the darkness behind her, more figures began to emerge. Their faces were blank, their skin waxy and gray. They moved toward Aiden in unison, their empty eyes locked onto him. Aiden backed away, but his feet tangled in the tree's roots and he fell hard onto his back. The figures surrounded him, their mouths moving in unison, each one repeating the same words. "You let us in. You let us in. You let us in." Aiden tried to scream, but the words died in his throat as they closed in, their hands reaching for him, their cold, clammy fingers pressing down on his skin. "You let us in," Lila's voice echoed, her face hovering inches from his. Her black eyes bore into his, and her lips parted, releasing a cloud of dark, acrid smoke. Aiden's vision blurred. The world around him swirled and darkened. The last thing he saw was Lila's face, her twisted smile stretching wider and wider until it was all he could see. Then, everything went black. Aiden awoke to the sensation of cold, damp earth pressing against his cheek. The air was heavy with the scent of decaying leaves and wet stone. Somewhere nearby, water dripped rhythmically, each drop echoing in the cavernous space. He groaned, pushing himself up onto his hands and knees. His head throbbed and his limbs felt leaden as though he had been asleep for days. "Lila," he croaked, his voice raw and hoarse. "Silence." Aiden's eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness. He was in a cavern, the walls slick with moisture and covered in patches of luminescent moss that cast a faint, eerie glow. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like rows of jagged teeth, and the ground beneath him was uneven, riddled with pits and hollows. The lantern, it was still there, hanging from a twisted root that jutted out of the ceiling. Its flame flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the cavern walls. And beneath it, standing motionless, was Lila. Lila! Aiden scrambled to his feet, his legs shaky beneath him. He staggered toward her, each step echoing through the cavern. Lila didn't move. Her eyes were closed, her head tilted back as if in a trance. The lantern's light bathed her face in a sickly, yellow glow, and her lips moved silently, forming words Aiden couldn't hear. Lila? Aiden reached out, his hand hovering inches from her shoulder. Suddenly, Lila's eyes snapped open. But they weren't her eyes, they were still black, empty, and void of any recognition. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. Aiden recoiled, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Lila, it's me. It's Aiden. Please, snap out of it." Lila's gaze remained fixed on the lantern. "You opened the door, Aiden. You let them in. And now they won't let you go." Before Aiden could respond, the cavern trembled. A low, deep rumble reverberated through the ground, sending stones and debris tumbling from the ceiling. The lantern's flame flickered wildly, casting frantic, disjointed shadows that seemed to twist and writhe like living things. Aiden grabbed Lila's arm. "We need to get out of here." But Lila didn't move. Her body was rigid, her gaze unblinking as the ground continued to quake beneath them. "Lila!" The ground split open with a deafening crack. Aiden staggered backward, his grip slipping from Lila's arm as a massive fissure tore through the cavern floor. From within the chasm, a thick, black mist began to seep out, coiling around Aiden's ankles like living tendrils. "You let them in," Lila said, her voice echoing in Aiden's mind. "And now they're taking you with them." The mist surged upward, enveloping Aiden in a suffocating embrace. The air grew icy cold, and the world around him began to blur, the cavern walls dissolving into a swirling void of darkness and shadow. Aiden gasped, his lungs burning as the mist filled his throat, choking him. He thrashed against it, his hands clawing at the air, but the darkness only tightened its grip, pulling him deeper and deeper into the abyss. "Lila!" he screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the void. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the mist receded. Aiden collapsed onto solid ground, coughing and sputtering. His vision swam, and his head throbbed with a blinding pain. When he finally opened his eyes, he was no longer in the cavern. He was standing in a vast, empty expanse. The ground beneath him was smooth, cold stone, and the air was thick with a dense, suffocating fog. The sky above was a void, a black, starless abyss that stretched on forever. And in the distance, barely visible through the fog, was the lantern. Its flame flickered weakly, casting a pale, sickly light across the ground. And beneath it, Lila stood, her eyes fixed on Aiden. But she wasn't alone. Figures surrounded her, their forms indistinct, their faces blank and featureless. They loomed over Lila, their hands resting on her shoulders, their eyes black and empty. Aiden staggered forward, but his legs refused to obey. It felt as though invisible hands were holding him back, dragging him down into the stone. "Aiden!" Lila's voice echoed through the fog, soft and distant. Aiden reached for her, his fingers trembling. "Lila, I'm coming." But the figures tightened their grip, and Lila's face contorted in pain. Her mouth opened, and from within, a dark, swirling mist began to pour out, flowing into the air like smoke. "Aiden!" Her scream echoed through the void, a haunting, desperate wail that pierced Aiden's very soul. And then the mist swallowed her whole. The figures faded into the fog, their forms dissolving like smoke. The lantern's flame flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging the world into complete and utter darkness. Aiden collapsed to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Lila," he whispered, his voice breaking. But the darkness remained, silent and all-consuming. And somewhere within it, the whispers began again, 1,000 voices, overlapping, chanting the same words over and over. "You let us in. You let us in. You let us in." The darkness stretched out endlessly, a void so complete that Aiden couldn't tell if his eyes were open or closed. The whispers echoed around him, a relentless chorus of overlapping voices that tugged at his sanity. Each word gnawed at his mind, burrowing deeper until they became indistinguishable from his own thoughts. "You let us in. You let us in." Aiden pressed his hands against his temples, clenching his jaw to keep from screaming. The voices surged, rising and falling like a tide, and with each wave, Aiden felt his grip on reality slipping. "Lila," he shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the void. A sudden flash of light seared through the darkness, blinding him. Aiden squeezed his eyes shut, and when he opened them again, he was no longer standing in the abyss. He was in a room. Aiden's old childhood bedroom. The walls were painted a soft, pastel blue, and the bed was neatly made, covered with the same faded quilt he remembered from his childhood. Toys were scattered across the floor, and a bookshelf lined with storybooks stood against the far wall. But the room wasn't right. The air was too still, the shadows too deep, and the scent a cloying, sickly sweet odor that reminded Aiden of rotting flowers. "Aiden!" The voice was soft, childlike, and it came from behind him. Aiden turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. A little boy stood in the corner of the room, his back to Aiden. The boy wore pajamas that were 2 sizes too big, the cuffs dragging against the floor. His hair was matted, and his shoulders were hunched as though he were hiding something. "Aiden!" The boy whispered again, his voice trembling. Aiden took a step forward. "Who are you?" The boy didn't answer. Instead, he began to hum softly, a haunting, lullaby-like tune that sent a chill down Aiden's spine. Aiden swallowed, his throat dry. "What are you humming?" The boy continued to hum, swaying slightly. The tune was achingly familiar, like a memory from a dream or a nightmare. Aiden's pulse quickened. "Turn around." The boy stopped humming. The room grew colder, and the shadows deepened, stretching out like dark, grasping hands. Slowly, the boy turned. Aiden's breath caught in his throat. The boy's face was a blank, empty void. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just smooth, featureless skin where a face should have been. "You let us in," the boy said, though his lips didn't move. "Now you can't get out?" Aiden stumbled backward, his legs tangling in the quilt. He fell, his back hitting the wooden floor with a dull thud. The boy took a step forward, his head tilting to the side. "You let us in," he repeated, and the voice was no longer that of a child. It was deeper, darker, a voice that echoed with the whispers of countless souls. The room began to change. The walls cracked, peeling away to reveal rotting, blackened beneath. The floorboards creaked and groaned as though something were moving beneath them. The air grew colder, and that sickly sweet scent intensified, making Aiden gag. The boy continued to advance, his featureless face inches from Aiden's. "Now you're one of us." Aiden scrambled to his feet, his hands shaking. The walls trembled, and the room seemed to expand and contract like a breathing lung. The shadows deepened, coiling around Aiden's ankles like dark tendrils. "No!" Aiden screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the whispers. "You let us in. You let us in. You let us in." Aiden turned, bolting for the door. But the hallway beyond the room was no longer the hallway of his childhood home. It was endless, stretching out in both directions, lined with hundreds of identical doors. Each door was slightly ajar, and from within, the whispers echoed. "You let us in." Aiden ran, his bare feet slapping against the cold wooden floor. The The doors seemed to multiply, closing in on him, each one opening just a crack to reveal glimpses of dark, empty rooms. A child's laughter echoed down the hallway, followed by the sound of a woman sobbing. Aiden's chest heaved as he ran, but no matter how far he went, the hallway stretched on, endless and unchanging. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, drowning out his own thoughts. And then he saw it. At the end of the hallway stood a single door, larger than the others. It was black, its surface smooth and polished, reflecting Aiden's terrified face. Aiden skidded to a stop, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The door loomed before him, and as he reached for the handle, it swung open on its own. Inside was darkness, complete and utter darkness. But within that darkness, Aiden could see them. The figures, the children, the faceless boy, and in the center of them all stood Lila. Her eyes were wide, her mouth open in a silent scream. The figures surrounded her, their hands reaching out, grasping, pulling her deeper into the abyss. "Lila!" Aiden shouted, but his voice was a mere whisper against the deafening roar of the whispers. Lila's eyes met his. They were filled with terror, with desperation, and then they rolled back into her head as the darkness swallowed her whole. The door slammed shut, the force of it sending Aiden flying backward. He hit the ground hard, his head striking the wooden floor. Stars exploded behind his eyes, and for a moment everything went black. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the cavern. The lantern hung overhead, its flame flickering weakly. The air was cold and the ground was wet beneath him. Aiden groaned, pushing himself to his feet. His head throbbed and his vision swam. But as he took a step forward, he felt something beneath his foot, something soft and wet. He looked down. It was Lila's coat, torn, blood-stained, and beneath it, half buried in the dirt, was her pendant, the one she always wore. The one Aiden had given her. Aiden picked it up, his fingers trembling. The pendant was cold, and as he held it, a single word echoed through the cavern, whispered by countless unseen mouths. "You let us in." Aiden's grip tightened around the pendant, his jaw clenching. "No," he whispered. "I didn't let you in. You took her. You took her, and now you're going to give her back." The whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a storm. The walls trembled and the lantern's flame flickered violently. Aiden took a deep breath, his eyes burning with a newfound resolve. "I'm coming for you, Lila, and I'm bringing you back." And with that, he stepped forward, deeper into the darkness. The darkness pressed in from all sides, a suffocating void that seemed to swallow sound and light alike. Aiden moved forward, his steps echoing in the vast emptiness. The lantern's dim glow bobbed and weaved, its flame flickering as though it might go out at any moment. Aiden's grip on Lila's pendant tightened. The small, cold metal felt like the only tangible thing in this unreal, nightmarish world. He kept his eyes forward, his jaw clenched, his breaths coming in slow, controlled bursts. The whispers followed him, skittering just beyond the reach of the lantern's light. Voices that slithered and hissed, overlapping in a discordant, ceaseless murmur. "You let us in. You let us in. You let us in." Aiden's teeth ground together. He forced himself to keep moving, each step heavier than the last. The ground beneath his feet was uneven, strewn with rocks and roots that seemed to shift and writhe beneath his weight. Ahead, the darkness deepened, coalescing into a mass of shadows that twisted and churned like a living entity. The shadows parted, and through them, Aiden saw a door. It was the same door from the hallway, black, smooth, and imposing. Its surface was polished to a mirror sheen, reflecting Aiden's drawn, haggard face. Aiden approached it cautiously. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as though warning him away. "Lila's in there," he muttered to himself, steeling his resolve. He reached for the handle. The door swung open before his hand could touch it, and a gust of icy wind blasted through the cavern, carrying with it the scent of decaying flowers and wet earth. Aiden shielded his face, squinting against the wind as the darkness within the doorway churned and swirled, forming into shapes. Figures. They stepped forward, emerging from the blackness one by one. Children, men, women, their eyes black and empty, their skin pale and lifeless. Their mouths hung open, and from their throats poured that same, haunting whisper. "You let us in." Aiden staggered back, his heart pounding. The figures advanced, their feet barely touching the ground as they moved toward him in unison. "Lila," he shouted, his voice echoing through the cavern. "Lila, can you hear me?" A low, rumbling groan reverberated through the cavern, and the ground beneath Aiden's feet began to quake. Cracks spiderwebbed across the stone floor, and from within them seeped that dark, swirling mist, the same mist that had swallowed him before. Aiden stepped back, his eyes darting around the cavern. The figures continued to advance, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. "You let us in. You let us in. You let us in." Aiden's back hit the cavern wall. There was nowhere to run. The mist rose around him, coiling up his legs, wrapping around his chest like a serpent. The air grew colder, each breath burning in his lungs. And then, through the black mist, he saw her. Lila. She stood just beyond the doorway, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her face was streaked with dirt, her hair tangled and matted. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but no sound came out. Aiden surged forward, his hand reaching for her. "Lila." The figures lunged. Aiden felt cold, clammy hands grabbing at his arms, his legs, his throat. They pulled him down, their fingers digging into his flesh, their whispers filling his ears until it was all he could hear. "You let us in. You let us in. You let us in." Aiden thrashed against them, his fists swinging wildly, but the figures held fast. Their eyes bore into him, dark, endless voids that threatened to consume his very soul. And then he heard her. "Aiden." Lila's voice echoed through the cavern, clear and sharp. Aiden's eyes snapped open, and through the sea of grasping hands and leering faces, he saw her. She was standing in the center of the cavern, her arms outstretched. The lantern hung above her, its light flaring brightly, burning away the mist. "Lila!" Aiden roared, summoning every ounce of strength he had left. He wrenched himself free from the figure's grasp, stumbling forward. Lila's eyes locked onto his, and in that moment, everything else fell away. The whispers, the darkness, the grasping hands, all of it faded, leaving only the two of them. Aiden reached her, his hands gripping her shoulders. "Lila, it's me. I'm here." Lila's eyes were wide, tears streaming down her cheeks. "They won't let me go, Aiden. They won't let me go." Aiden shook his head, pulling her into his arms. "Yes, they will. I won't let them take you." The cavern trembled violently, the ground heaving beneath them. The lantern's light flared again, its flame burning brighter, hotter, until it was almost blinding. The figures shrieked, recoiling from the light, their voices rising in a cacophony of screams and wails. Aiden tightened his grip on Lila, shielding her with his body as the cavern walls began to crumble, stones raining down from above. The mist swirled around them, whipping into a frenzy, and through it all, the whispers continued. "You let us in. You let us in. You let us in." Aiden squeezed his eyes shut, holding Lila close. "Not anymore," he whispered. And then everything went white. When Aiden opened his eyes again, he was lying on his back, staring up at a clear, starless sky. The air was still and silent, the scent of wet earth lingering in his nostrils. He sat up, blinking in the dim light. He was outside, lying on the banks of the river. The water lapped gently at the shore, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the landscape. "Lila?" Aiden turned, his heart hammering. Lila lay beside him, her eyes closed, her chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. Aiden's breath hitched. He reached out, brushing a lock of hair from her forehead. Lila stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Aiden," she murmured, her voice weak and groggy. Aiden's throat tightened and he pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. "I'm here," he whispered, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I'm here." Lila's arms wrapped around him, and for a moment they held each other in silence, the river murmuring softly beside them. But as Aiden closed his eyes, a single whisper echoed through his mind, faint and distant, but unmistakable. "You let us in." The whisper lingered like a cold breath against Aiden's skin, unsettling and persistent. He forced himself to push it aside, focusing instead on Lila's fragile warmth in his arms. The river's gentle murmur was a balm against the lingering dread that clung to him like a shadow. "Are you okay?" Aiden asked softly, brushing dirt from her cheek. Lila's eyes, wide and haunted, met his. I don't know. I feel like I'm still trapped somewhere." Aiden swallowed hard. "We're out now. We made it." But deep inside, he knew the truth was far more complicated. The nightmare had not ended, it had simply retreated, waiting, watching, biding its time. They rose slowly, hands still clasped tightly, and began walking along the riverbank, their footsteps muffled by the damp earth. The forest stretched around them, dense and whispering with the sound of unseen creatures stirring in the night. As they walked, the silence was broken by a sudden, sharp noise, a snap of a branch nearby. Both froze, eyes darting to the shadows beyond the trees. A figure emerged, cloaked in darkness. The flicker of the lantern in Aiden's hand cast long, trembling shadows, but the figure's face remained obscured. "Who's there?" Aiden called, voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. The figure stepped forward, revealing a pale, gaunt woman with eyes as dark as the cavern below. Her lips curled into a knowing smile. "You have returned," she said, her voice a soft, chilling melody. "But the price has not been paid." Lila clutched Aiden's arm, fear blooming in her eyes. "What do you mean?" "We left that place behind." The woman's smile widened. "You may leave the cavern, but the darkness does not leave you. It follows, it feeds, it waits for the moment to consume what little light remains." Aiden's grip on the lantern tightened. "What do you want from us?" "To remind you," she whispered, "that some doors are never truly closed, and some debts must be repaid." Before they could react, she dissolved into the night, leaving behind a chilling silence and the heavy weight of an unspoken threat. Aiden looked at Lila, determination hardening his gaze. "We have to find a way to end this for good." Lila nodded, though the fear still trembled in her hands. "Where do we even start?" Aiden looked toward the dark forest where the shadows seemed to pulse and breathe. "By going back. By facing what we left behind." Aiden and Lila stood at the edge of the forest, the darkness thick around them like a living thing. The air was heavy, saturated with whispers from the unseen, as if the trees themselves remembered their passage. But this time they would not run. This time they would confront the abyss within. Guided by the faint glow of the cursed stone in Aiden's hand, they stepped into the shadowed depths, the forest closing in like a vault. The path twisted unnaturally, roots reaching like grasping fingers, pulling at their resolve, threatening to drown them in fear. But together they pressed on. At the cavern's entrance, the air grew cold and still, suffused with the scent of damp earth and decay. Inside, the darkness pulsed with a malevolent life, shadows shifting and stretching into the shapes of lost souls. Silent screams etched into the fabric of night. Aiden raised the glowing stone. Its light cut through the gloom, illuminating the hollow where the darkness had first taken hold. There, in the center, lay a twisted, gnarled root, pulsing with a black, oily substance that seemed to breathe. Lila stepped forward, voice trembling but resolute. "This is the heart." Aiden nodded, raising the stone higher. "We end this now." The stone blazed with light, pure and fierce, and the cavern trembled as the darkness screamed, writhing, trying to claw its way back. But the light was relentless. It burned through shadow, through fear, through the ancient curse that had poisoned this place. Roots cracked, splintered, and fell away, revealing a small, weathered relic beneath. The source of the evil, a twisted amulet forged in despair and sorrow. With a steady hand, Aiden crushed it beneath his boot. The cavern shuddered one last time, then fell silent, as if the very breath of darkness had been snuffed out. Exhausted but victorious, Aiden and Lila emerged into the dawn, the first pale light filtering through the trees, carrying with it the promise of peace. But as they looked back once more, a faint whisper drifted on the breeze, soft, sibilant, and unmistakable. The abyss remembers, and somewhere, deep beneath the roots, a faint pulse of darkness stirred anew.